There are friendships that last a lifetime, and then there are the ones that shape who you become, the ones so deeply woven into your identity that losing them feels like losing part of yourself. For Robbie Robertson, that friendship was with Levon Helm. Two men who built something extraordinary together, who stood side by side on some of the most legendary stages in rock and roll history, and who ultimately spent the better part of 3 decades unable to be in the same room. For years, the world watched from a distance, catching only fragments of what had gone wrong between them. Rumors circulated. Accusations surfaced in memoirs and interviews. Fans picked sides. The music press packaged it neatly as one of rock music's great feuds, a tidy narrative that made for compelling headlines, but missed the far more complicated human story buried underneath. What most people never fully understood was what Robbie Robertson actually believed about all of it, not the version filtered through publicists or shaped by legal disputes, but the raw, personal truth he carried with him for decades and only began speaking openly about near the very end of his life. Before his death in August 2023, Robertson pulled back the curtain in ways he had carefully avoided for years. What he revealed wasn't the story of two enemies. It was something far sadder, far more human, and far harder to resolve. To understand what eventually tore Robbie Robertson and Levon Helm apart, you first have to understand what brought them together. Their story didn't start in sold-out arenas or recording studios. It started in the gritty, unglamorous world of Canadian club circuits, where a young rockabilly singer named Ronnie Hawkins was building one of the tightest backing bands North America had ever heard. Levon Helm had come up from Arkansas, carrying the deep rhythmic soul of the American South with him into the cold, unfamiliar landscape of Ontario. He joined Hawkins in 1957 and became the full-time drummer after finishing high school in 1958. He was the anchor, the heartbeat, the one whose playing made everything else feel inevitable. Robbie Robertson came along a few years later, a young guitarist from Toronto with extraordinary instincts and an almost frightening hunger to learn. Along with Rick Danko, Richard Manuel, and Garth Hudson, they formed a unit that was more than the sum of its parts. Hawkins ran a relentlessly demanding operation. Late-night rehearsals after already exhausting shows were standard. Shortcuts were not tolerated. You either sharpened yourself against the grind or you were replaced. For years, that pressure forged the group into something special. But eventually, the restrictions became suffocating. Hawkins fined musicians for bringing girlfriends to shows, banned marijuana entirely, and maintained an iron grip on every aspect of the band's professional life. By late 1963, the relationship had run its course. They walked away and began striking out on their own. For the next couple of years, they moved through names and identities, searching for the right footing. They played small venues, chased opportunities, and tried to carve out an identity separate from the man who had made them. Then in 1965, a phone call arrived that changed everything. Bob Dylan was going electric, and he needed a band that could handle the fire that came with it. The decision to tour with Bob Dylan felt, at the time, like the breakthrough they had been grinding toward for years. Dylan had heard about them through connections in the music world, and once he saw them play, the decision came quickly. But Helm and Robertson made something clear from the very beginning. They came as a package. If Dylan wanted them, he was taking the whole band. Dylan agreed, and the tour began. What followed was one of the most turbulent and historically significant chapters in rock and roll history. Night after night, as Dylan stepped onto the stage with electric guitar in hand, the backlash from folk purists was ferocious. Audiences booed. They heckled. At Manchester's Free Trade Hall in May 1966, someone in the crowd screamed the word Judas at Dylan, a moment so raw and defiant that recordings of it would be studied and discussed for generations. Dylan's response was to turn to the band and tell them to play it louder. They did. But the psychological toll of touring through that kind of hostility was enormous. Dylan, by multiple accounts, was pushing himself through the exhaustion with chemical assistance, leaning heavily on amphetamines to sustain the pace. The atmosphere around the tour became increasingly erratic, increasingly intense. Levon Helm reached his breaking point first. After just over a month, he walked away entirely. Not a quiet step back, but a full disappearance. While the rest of the band continued touring with Dylan, Helm went to work on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, trading the chaos of rock and roll for the physical, grounded labor of a completely different world. It was, in retrospect, the first significant fracture between the two men. Helm left. Robertson stayed. At the time, it might not have seemed like much, just a man who couldn't take the abuse and needed a way out. But the shape it created was already there, quietly forming. Robertson was the one who remained. Robertson was the one who kept working. And in the grinding, difficult studio sessions that followed, it was Robertson's guitar that Dylan leaned on most heavily, while others were absent. The imbalance had found its first foothold. When Dylan's motorcycle accident in July 1966 brought the entire touring machine to a sudden halt, the band drifted back to smaller venues and lesser stages, waiting. Then Dylan called them to Woodstock. Several members rented a large pink house outside of town, and what emerged from those informal, unplanned sessions was something genuinely magical. Loose, intimate recordings made without commercial pressure, songs that felt like they had been discovered rather than written. Levon Helm returned, and his presence filled the room again. By the time those sessions concluded in late 1967, the five of them had something they had never quite had before, a genuine artistic identity. They became the band, and the world took notice. When their debut album arrived in 1968, the critical reception was overwhelming. Reviewers ran out of superlatives. Musicians paid close attention. The music sounded ancient and immediate at the same time, rooted in American mythology while speaking directly to the present moment. Success came quickly and completely. Bigger stages, major festival appearances, the full machinery of mainstream rock stardom. But success, as it so often does, began to reveal rather than resolve the tensions already present within the group. As the band's profile grew, Robbie Robertson began taking on more and more of the organizational and creative leadership. To Robertson, this was a natural response to circumstances. The band was not functioning as a collective unit in the way it might have on paper. Drug and alcohol use was accelerating. Reliability was becoming an issue. Songs weren't flowing from everyone equally. Someone had to hold the structure together, and Robertson stepped into that role. From Levon Helm's perspective, the story looked completely different. What Robertson described as necessary leadership, Helm experienced as a slow and deliberate consolidation of power. The songwriting credits, the decision-making authority, the public profile, all of it seemed to be tilting toward one man. Helm felt that something essential about the band's original democratic spirit was being quietly dismantled. He felt overlooked, sidelined, stripped of an ownership that was rightfully his. The resentment didn't arrive in a single explosion. It built in layers, one decision at a time, one credit line at a time, 1 year at a time. Robertson would later reflect that he understood why Helm felt the way he did, even if he never fully accepted Helm's characterization of events. He acknowledged that the imbalance was real. He acknowledged that the way things had unfolded was not what any of them had originally imagined. But he also believed that without someone holding things together, there would have been nothing left to argue over. The band was coming apart from the inside, and Robertson felt he had been the one try to hold the wall up while others struggled to stay standing. By the mid-1970s, the band that had seemed unstoppable a few years earlier was visibly struggling. Their 1975 album failed to achieve the commercial and critical impact they had hoped for. Tours were playing to smaller venues. The gap between where they had been and where they now were was impossible to ignore. Then in September 1976, Richard Manuel suffered a serious neck injury in a boating accident in Texas. Robertson had already been thinking about ending the live chapter of the band's story. The accident accelerated something that had already been forming in his mind. He proposed a farewell concert, a final night designed to close things out with dignity and ceremony rather than letting the slow decline continue. What happened on Thanksgiving Day, 1976, at the Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco became one of the most celebrated events in rock history. 5,000 people were served turkey dinners, An extraordinary lineup of guests filled the stage. Martin Scorsese, a close personal friend of Robertson's, filmed the entire evening. The Last Waltz was documented, deliberate, and undeniably magnificent. But for Levon Helm, it was also something else entirely. In the years that followed, Helm was deeply vocal about his belief that The Last Waltz had never been a collective decision. It had been Robertson's decision, Robertson's vision, Robertson's farewell, executed on Robertson's timeline without genuine agreement from the rest of the band. To Helm, the concert wasn't a shared goodbye. It was something imposed on him, the final assertion of a power he had been watching Robertson accumulate for years. The fact that Scorsese, Robertson's close friend, was the one preserving it all on film only deepened Helm's sense that the entire narrative was being written by one hand. Robertson never denied the essential truth of this. In later interviews, he openly acknowledged that The Last Waltz had been his statement, shaped by his vision. He said that if others felt it hadn't represented them, he was prepared to accept that. He believed the film stood on its own terms and expressed no regret about claiming authorship of it. That honesty, depending on how you read it, could be seen as either admirably self-aware or remarkably tone-deaf. Perhaps it was both. After The Last Waltz, the silence between Robertson and Helm hardened into something permanent. While Robertson moved into film scoring, solo albums, and a new chapter of creative life in Los Angeles, Helm struggled financially and personally. He fought health problems, battled addiction, and dealt with what he described as the continuing theft of royalties and recognition he felt he was owed. His autobiography, published in 1993, laid out his grievances without softening the edges. Robertson was cast as the villain of Helm's story, the man who had taken the band's communal spirit and turned it into his own personal asset. Robertson found these characterizations deeply painful, not because they criticized him, which he could handle, but because they reduced something vast and complicated into a simple morality tale. He felt that Helm's anger, which was real and understandable, had needed a target, and that target had become Robertson himself. He reflected in interviews that if it hadn't been him, the resentment would have found someone else. He wasn't dismissing Helm's pain. He was trying to locate its source, and he believed that source had more to do with Helm's own interior struggles than with anything Robertson had actually done. There were years when they did not speak at all. When Rick Danko died in 1999, the grief that might have bridged the distance between them instead revealed how far it had grown. Helm reportedly made it known that he would not attend Danko's funeral if Robertson was present. That was the measure of it. Two men who had once been as close as brothers, refusing to share the same room, even to mourn a mutual friend they had both loved. Richard Manuel's death by suicide